that started. All right, that's where we had. This is where we ended. Greeley. Right. Any questions from you guys before we start? Okay. So we weren't here Monday, obviously. So we've not gotten any further since last Wednesday. We are almost done with chapter 14, so we'll be able to get into 15 here in just a second. So that'll be some amount of progress. So yeah, we finished with this last time. Horace Greeley and Grant. But then with the financial collapse and the narrowing of the 14th Amendment, a lot of the protections of the Reconstruction were dismantled, and the presidential election of 1876 really crystallizes this, and neither candidate is especially important. We never talk about them ever again, but the outcome of the election is still a pretty big deal. We had Rutherford B. Hayes, nominated by Republicans. He was a Civil War officer and was not really part of Grant's administration, so he was seen as being free of the corruption during Grant's time in office. The Democrats had Samuel J. Tilden, who fought corruption in New York, so great. Everyone's anti-corruption, so we don't have to worry about that. However, it was an extremely close election. Tilden technically won 51% of the popular vote, but due to, I guess, how the delegates were being voted in and out in, let's see, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, these votes got muddled, to put it as simply as I can. What did I put? Oh. So, as far as I can describe it simply, the the Republicans were being voted out in favor of Democrats in the South, which was the normal way of things at this period. And apparently the outgoing Republicans voted for Hayes, and the incoming Democrats voted for Tilden, which, I don't feel like the outgoing candidates should be able to vote because they're no longer in office. I don't understand why that was a thing. It doesn't matter, though, because it caused a big issue. Middle. This led to a split in the Senate and the House of Representatives, so there was no clear winner. They created a 15-member joint electoral committee, 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent. Obviously, it was going to be split down the middle, and the independent would have to make the tie-breaking choice. The independent left. They didn't want to have anything. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. And then his replacement voted with the Republicans, and therefore Hayes won. Technically. However, because Congress was still split, the Southern Democrats threatened to filibuster until inauguration, which would be a constitutional crisis because you're supposed to have all this taken care of. So as I always tell students, don't let people tell you that, oh, things used to be so much more civil back in the old days. Now, people were a bunch of childish assholes back then too. So we had the Compromise of 1877. Hayes was able to become president, However, he had to promise to elect a Southerner to his cabinet, withdraw federal troops from the South, and build a transcontinental railroad through the South as well, because that's, as we're going to see in the next couple of chapters, like the lifeblood of the economy at this time. And the point of all this is that it showed that even though the Civil War was still real recent, I mean, this has been, 11 years since the end of the Civil War? The Southern Democrats were now back in power, and with the pressure they put on the government, the Reconstruction was over. The federal protection of the free people in the South was over. Any kind of increase of civil rights was well and truly dead, and things were going to be not great for the next several decades. Because that's just how politics works. Because not everybody can really hold the momentum and push for moral decency. So this was the outcome of it, which again was really close. Technically, Tilden won popular vote, but as far as the electoral votes, it was pretty much neck and neck. Where's my mouse? There we go. And that reason Hayes has that extra one is because of the that commission they put together. Now, the book just puts it like that. That there was the scuffle, and then the Southern Democrats were like, oh, well, we'll just filibuster and hold up the decision and blah, blah, blah. There was a lot more violent rhetoric than that. There was threats of another civil war. The KKK was involved, because of course they were, even though technically they had been disbanded by this point, but they never really went away. Yeah, and then of course Tilden or Blood here. It was rough. It was a real rough time for the government post-Civil War. And then we have the northern response to that, dedicated to the Chicago Convention, yeah. In memory of the useless sacrifice, or Union heroes lost in the useless war, because, I mean, basically by the end of this, things were pretty much back to the way they had been. Sure, slavery was technically over, but now the federal government couldn't prevent southern states from really, really restricting the rights of black Americans, and boy would they. And the South was able to steer federal decisions, just barely 10 years after the war. So yeah, this was a rough time. And again, it doesn't matter that Hayes won, it doesn't matter if Tilden won. Neither really did anything with their time in office. They're not important men, but this event was important. Yeah, and that's the end of the Reconstruction. Which is why it's not exactly my favorite part of history, because it's like there's all this stuff that needs to get done. They start getting stuff done, and then it all gets taken apart at the end. So by the time we're done with it, it's like very few things actually were accomplished, and in some places it's worse than it was. So yeah, it's kind of depressing. Free people were not allowed land ownership, so they had no kind of economic independence. Of course, you had the Redeemers, who brought the government back under conservative control and ensured that any kind of measures to aid the former slaves would be very much reversed. And then, of course, I mean, North and South, everyone was still really racist, and we're not exactly like, oh yeah, they're people just like us and should be treated as such. Not especially. Still, though, at the least, the end of slavery was enshrined in the Constitution, even if, again, there is the whole 13th Amendment thing with the, if you go to prison, you're technically allowed to be put to work without pay. And then there's all the fun laws and such in the South that specifically target Black Americans, but hey, that's not what the Constitution's for, apparently. And with emancipation, this all did, again, while I said it was a partial measure, things were not quite where I would like them to be. I mean, obviously. But there was some progress in the country as a whole. Even if it was, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, it's a real hobbling gait to get us where we need to be. Let me make sure that I don't have that. Okay, yeah. Refresh. Okay, and that is muted. Great. Alright. So yeah. That's chapter 14. Now we can move on to chapter 15. And this should already be up on Blackboard. Alright. Alright. So, as I had said previously, we are going back to 1865 chronologically. There we go. To 1896. So technically some of this is going to be happening during the Reconstruction, but we're not really going to be talking too much about that. So just be aware some of this will be happening prior to the end of the previous chapter. So, heading westward. If you've never been out west, if you've just been here on the East Coast, east of the Appalachians especially, the Great Plains are weird. They're semi-arid. They've got a bunch of grasslands, but very few trees. The natives that lived there knew how to support themselves. They knew how to handle the way the land worked, the many animals that lived there. But when it came to American farmers, they were used to the pretty rich, fertile lands here in the southeast and also between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. So when they moved west, they couldn't farm like they had before. So the most efficient way of making money out west was to have herds of livestock and let them roam around and eat all this free grass that's out there, because there's not much else. And while the Old West is associated with individualism, self-sufficiency, this idea of people going out and making a homestead and living out on their own and not having to deal with the big cities or the government or any of that. And a lot of times even the encroachment of the federal government was seen as like infringing on the lives of these frontiersmen. That's not exactly how it went. Realistically, these lands were granted to these people by the federal government, as well as all the mining towns were obviously run by like big corporations. You didn't have just random people opening these big underground mines. And also, of course, railroads, because that's where all the money was. And the railroads were pushing west, and they owned a lot of money to put their owned a lot of land to put their railroads down, and then would sell off the extra land to settlers. So that was a big part of it. It was a group effort. Yes, the settlers who went west had to deal with a lot of stuff on their own. It was not an easy, I'm not saying it was easier than these stories say it was, but it wasn't as one guy against nature like you'd hear. So the money for all these projects, mining, lumber companies, and of course railroads, came from overseas. Typically Europe, and especially Britain. Britain had lots of money, but Britain has had a worldwide empire for several centuries at this point, and they were the first to develop the railroad. Because Britain's a lot more just flat than our country. So when the railroad made its way over here, they had to be significantly upgraded to handle the more rough terrain. But all that to say, the British really liked putting money into westward expansion because they could make a profit off of it if it went well. And of course, the biggest investment was railroads. Again, that's in case I haven't made that clear. It's always railroads. The most important of the railroads was the Transcontinental. The Central Pacific Company built from west to east from Sacramento, California, and tended to employ Chinese immigrants, whereas the Union Pacific Railroad from Council Bluffs, Iowa, heading west, hired mostly Irish immigrants. They met in Promontory Point, Utah, in May of 1869, and famously, there was Grant was there to drive a gold railroad tie or road spike into the joining lines. Obviously, they then immediately took it out and replaced it with a proper railroad tie because A, that would get stolen immediately, and B, gold is really soft, and you don't want that holding together your train tracks. It just doesn't work that way. However, all that said, we used to take 6 to 8 weeks by wagon train, and assuming you survived, now you could get on a train and within a week be in California. Which, honestly, considering how efficient our train systems are nowadays, is probably about the same amount of time it would take you to get to California by train. It's a bit crazy, because passenger trains have to yield to freight trains here in the U.S. apparently. FYI. The book also mentions that because so much money was being put into these railroads, obviously people were skimming off the top. The book mentions here Union Pacific promoters created a fake construction company called Credit Mobilier, which they used to funnel government bond and contract money into their own pockets. They then bribed congressmen to avoid investigation. Despite these efforts, in 1872, Congress exposed these wrongdoings. So, yeah, if there's money, there's corruption. That's, again, not exactly a new thing, but I figured I'd mention it since the book devotes like a very small paragraph to it. So here we have the United States as of 1850, pre Civil War. Who can tell me why California is a state, but you've got all these territories between it and the rest of these states? Like, why was California singled out as like, hey, we need to make this a state like immediately? I think I heard it. Yes. Yeah. It's gold. It's gold over there. And something I haven't mentioned in this class, but the way that states were formed, you had these territories, and they eventually did coalesce into obviously the states that we know today. But once each territory reached a certain population, they would be able to apply for statehood. However, with this being semi-arid plains, and this being freaking desert, and this being where the gold was, people just skipped all this and went straight to the gold. So the population exploded over here in California, and we immediately made it a state because you're going to want to tax these people mining this gold. Also, we took this from Mexico during the Mexican-American War, which was just prior to the Civil War. So, like, San Francisco already existed. It was already a settled, I don't want to say town. It was a city already before, like, we even got there. So, like, this was already a pretty developed area. We just kind of absorbed it. So the Great Plains have a number of different regions, but they are all still just awful, flat, sometimes rolling hills, but still just grassland. My family decided when I was in 6th grade, I believe, let's take a road trip to Yellowstone National Park, which is here. So we drove from Florence, South Carolina to here, all the way across the country. And yeah, once you get past the Mississippi, it is just flat grassland. It's horribly monotonous. I distinctly remember my sister and I sitting up in the car and pointing out the window because we saw a small group of trees off in the distance. It's the first trees we'd seen in like 2 days. It was surreal. I don't know how the people mentally survived going across in wagons. Just seeing that for weeks, I'd lose my mind. A lot of them did. I guess I shouldn't say that like that wasn't a thing that happened. Okay, I have a better version of this in the next chapter, but FYI, we have time zones because of the railroads system. Because each city had their own time, which was weird. Boston and New York were on different times. Now, they weren't like hours off, but they were, I always say 15 minutes just around, but I think the book says it's like 11 minutes and 45 seconds. Like, it's something stupid. And so these trains, which were moving, at least for back then, at lightning speeds, and actually sticking to a schedule that wasn't, oh, the horse felt sick and didn't go as fast today, needed to standardize time. And since our country is so wide, and, you know, the sun sets over here sooner than it does over there, they created these time zones based on, largely on the train systems, because you can see there's this weird, like, thing here with Georgia. Eventually, the U.S. government standardized it after World War I, but we'll get to that more next chapter. There's a Transcontinental Railroad. see, like through a lot of scrubland desert here, and this is through like the mountains, because this is the Rockies are here. Well, yeah. And it was, like many projects they put immigrants on, a very deadly job. Many people died making the Transcontinental Railroad. But hey, they're immigrants, so who cares, right? That's how things tend to be here in the U.S. But yeah, it was a monumental undertaking. Hmm. Do we talk about the Erie Canal in the next chapter? I don't remember. No, we're talking about Rockefeller. Yeah. We'll get to the Erie Canal later. All right. So, obviously, when the American settlers were heading west, the Great Plains were not exactly empty. The American continents had been full of Native Americans for centuries, if not millennia, and based on recent evidence, perhaps many more millennia than we even realized. However, Native Americans were not just this single group that had the same beliefs and ideas. They were very diverse and very, very numerous. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of different tribes and languages, customs, beliefs, etc. By the end of the Civil War, there were about 350,000 Native Americans west of the Mississippi. Prior to that, there had been upwards of 1 million. And, prior to the Spanish conquistadors rolling in, there had been several million, if not tens of millions. Also, west were the descendants of said conquistadors that lived in the Southwest and California since before Jamestown was ever founded. Because again, if you've not had my previous course, the Spanish were here in the Americas in the late 1400s, early 1500s, and Jamestown didn't exist until I can never remember the year. It was the 1600s, to say the least. It was not we were like, oh, Jamestown was the first English settlement in North America. It's like, yeah, St. Augustine had been there for 100 years by that point. And also, we had people living in California and what is now the American Southwest for at least a century prior to Jamestown ever being founded. As far as the natives east of the Mississippi were driven west across the Mississippi during the presidency of Jackson. There were some natives that were able to stick around a little bit longer, such as the Cherokee and the Seminole, either through their own, what's the word? They used the government against the government. They created their own little republic within Georgia, for example, the Cherokees. The Seminoles just continued to fight, and they were really good at it. So when it came to expansion westward, the multitude of these different tribes were both a help and a hindrance to American expansion. Because these tribes were as different from one another as, say, the European countries were, France and Spain and England, and Germany didn't quite exist yet, but these various different cultures, they're seen as being very different because, we're used to thinking about Europe as this very diverse area. that's how different these tribes were from one another. They've had rivalries for hundreds of years. They often didn't even speak the same language. They've been conquering one another for hundreds of years. So the Europeans, and then later the Americans, encroaching on their land was just an outside threat that was secondary to this ancestral antagonism they've had with their neighbors for, again, literally centuries. But what that means here is that if the American government made a treaty with this farming community here, over the hill, there might be another tribe that still wants their blood. A treaty here does not affect the next group at all. However, once the American policy changed from treaties, which the American government tended to break anyway, because we're real good at that, to just exterminating the natives also tended to not be able to work together very well. Again, not just because of this generational animosity towards one another, but they often were, they don't speak the same language. It's hard to work with the group that you can't even communicate with. What was the other thing I was going to say here? Oh, but this also meant, to a degree, that you couldn't really have like one big climatic battle. You couldn't have, Gettysburg against Native Americans, because if you completely destroy a tribe in this huge battle, great. That doesn't affect the other tribes in the slightest. They might recognize that, oh, this was a real powerful tribe and the American government butchered them. That's a problem, but it's not going to affect them in terms of material or men. Another issue with how the American government and natives understood one another was land ownership, which is to say, Native Americans, by and large, and again, I don't like to generalize because of how different they were, but typically, there was no idea of land ownership among Native Americans. You owned stuff, you owned your weapons and your tools and your horses and whatever, but land was both everybody's and nobody's. And especially because a lot of these tribes were nomadic, you moved around. So it's not like, this is my land here, because you didn't live there all the time. You would move, again, especially the tribes that would like hunt bison and stuff, you moved with the herds. There was no land that was yours. Also, as I was mentioning with the bison was central to many of these plains tribes and were really necessary for their survival. Needless to say, they were the largest animal on the plains in terms of meat, but also, their leather was really good for clothing and making shelter. Their bones were used for tools and weapons. You could even use their dung once it dried up to start fires, because it was just this flammable, because there wasn't much wood to go around. There weren't many trees, so you made do with what you had. This is going to come up a little bit later. So yeah. And I have this image, which obviously is a huge image that could be zoomed in on a bunch because everything's really super tiny. These various color areas are not tribes, they are linguistic groups. This is similar languages that these people were speaking, but were still many separate tribes within those areas. You can see some of these areas are specifically divided to show some of the various tribes, but even within those areas have separate tribal affiliations. Lots and lots of different tribes. And also, I remember for my American technology course, we started with Alaska because, moving across from the Bering Strait to Alaska. I had a map of Alaska that was this big and this detailed of the various native groups just in Alaska. So, yeah, we've genocided a lot of people. It's awful. Oh, speaking of, I mentioned horses. I forget that not everybody knows this. Horses aren't native to North America. Horses, at least those that were used by the natives in the time of westward expansion, were brought over by Europeans, got loose, became wild, and then were recaptured by the natives and used by them. They're the various, especially the movies, where it's like, oh yeah, horses are a part of native culture. It's like, yeah, since like 100 years ago at the time that most of these stories were made. They're real recent, relatively speaking. But something that, again, to paint a broad brush, natives are really good at adaptation, and horses were a good example. Also, the fact that many of them very quickly learned how to use guns. They couldn't manufacture them because they didn't have, the machinery and whatnot, but they knew how to use them. They knew what they needed. They needed the powder and the bullets and whatnot. All right. Federal policy. So early on, each group of natives were considered an autonomous nation. Each had their ownership recognized by the federal government, which again, at least as the federal government understood. But as I said, if you go into an area and there's like a group of natives living on this plot of land, and say, okay, that's your plot of land, they might as well be camping there, because they might be up and gone the next week. But the American mind cannot comprehend that. Of course, though, we had the Treaty of Fort Laramie to keep the whites off of native land and vice versa. However, the gold rush was a thing, and, well, greed tends to conquer all, and whites were constantly wandering into native lands, causing ruckus, and very rarely facing any kind of legal consequences. And by causing ruckus, I mean murdering natives. November 29th, 1864. So again, this is Civil War is still kind of coming to an end. 700 Cheyennes and Arapahoes gathered at Sand Creek, Colorado. They had been promised the protection of the U.S. government. However, the colonel there, Colonel John M. Shivington, and his troops decided instead they would murder them. The natives quickly raised a white flag of surrender, but it didn't stop the American troops. And by the end, 270 natives, mostly women and children, had been scalped and killed. And if you're not familiar with scalping, that is literally cutting the skin from the top of your head while you're still alive, usually in like a single brutal motion, because the hair and scalp were like trophies to prove that you had been killing lots of natives. And women, children, it didn't matter. Scalps were scalps, and you got paid a bounty. And so they had a congressional investigation. The action was, quote, barbarous, but nothing really happened. And we'll talk about Mr. Shivington a little bit, in just a little bit. Now, needless to say, the natives were none too pleased with any of this. So many tribes rose up to fight back against the American government, which resulted in various wars, which often ended in the army rolling in and slaughtering entire villages, the reservations getting smaller. Lieutenant Colonel George Custer was one such leader who had his men burning native villages, and then eventually had himself and his men killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana. And despite what some real simplistic history will teach you, was not a heroic end for this man. He was a murderer, and he deserved worse than he got. Also, the book just sort of mentions this there at the end, and I figured I'd include it because it's a neat little bit of information. Among the troops that battled the natives were African Americans known as Buffalo Soldiers, a name given to them by natives but whose origin is unclear. So, black men that actually were able to get out of the South and find some kind of employment beyond sharecropping, which, again, wasn't exactly that much above slavery anyway. And the fact that they were allowed to, well, I'll get into that in a minute. Some of them were allowed to carry weapons was a pretty big deal. Most of them were like camp aides and whatnot. So let's take a look at John Shivington, the Reverend John M. Shivington. So he wasn't just a colonel, but also a reverend. Damnity man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. And his other quote here, scalps are what I'm after. I long to be wading in gore. Yeah, he was a great guy. But that is the only quote I have from him. Here's a quote from, this is attributed to the massacre. Kill and scalp all, big and little. So the children getting murdered in the middle of this wasn't just like an oopsie doodle. It was part of the orders. And this is the famous Custer's Last Stand, where he's heroically fighting against the savage onslaught. Yeah. He did get surrounded and put down. But again, he made something of a habit of slaughtering native villages. So now to do have a more just like where he was going and what he was doing. It was a running battle. Those skirmishes, and then they made their way across the mountains here, and then finally to the hill where they were surrounded and defeated. And then also a really good image of just 1800s photography and the Buffalo Soldiers just hanging out. Again, most of them aren't really armed. There's a guy, I have to keep remembering that this is actually a line thing. There's a guy back here with a saucepan right up here. So yeah, a lot of them probably cook. So this guy's got a shovel, so they probably did like work building the camp. So Yeah, it wasn't. It certainly wasn't equal. But I do like to include this because, with a lot of other similar images of this era, and with especially like military men, this was the style of photography. I've got another image in my European history class of British soldiers laid out just like this. You got several sitting, several standing. You've got one dude lounged out in the front for some reason. That was just how it was done back then. And the fact that despite all the discrimination and all the everything that's going on, again, especially because this is still like just post-Civil War, probably still trying to do the whole Reconstruction thing, that they're at least enough of a part of the Army that culture is bleeding into the photography style. It says something. I don't know what all it says, but it says something. All right. So, as I said, with the natives not really working together, it does help a little bit because, again, you can't have like one big decisive battle and it's all over. But compared to the U.S. military, it was a war of attrition and the natives were losing. The U.S. military was advanced, well organized, had more numbers, more technology, just more everything. Now, granted, there were some victories on the side of the natives. There were some battles where the natives were victorious, but by and large, it was a steamroller. It was a gradual, crushing push through the native resistance. But even more devastating than these military defeats was the fact that we're really good at destroying animal populations, and the bison were nearly wiped out during this time period, due in part to railroads expanding, settlers not wanting the bison on their land, and also apparently there was this weird fad in the East for bison products. So bison were nearly wiped out, and this caused a wave of starvation across the plains. So the reservations continued to shrink. The American government continued to break treaties because we're real good at that. Kids haven't said that already. Folks back east actually started to think maybe we were going a little far. Maybe we shouldn't just genocide everybody. So there was some reform policy being pushed in the east. The most progressive for this was assimilation, where the natives would be brought into the, quote, superior white culture and have to abandon their, quote, inferior native ways. Because, you know, even the most progressive folks back then were still really, really racist. So we have the Dawes Act. The way this went, tribal rule was completely abolished. Each family had a little bit of land, and within 25 years, if they took care of the land and abandoned all their old ways, they could be made citizens. The main thing about the Dawes Plan was, though, that this took all the tribal land, gave the worst bits to the natives, and then sold off the, quote, excess land to wealthy settlers and railroad companies and whatnot. Because, of course, that's how it went. There was one final gasp of resistance The prophet Lavoka received a vision that the Native Americans would one day rule over the world again, and that the ghost dance would make this happen. So this was the collection of, let me see. Lavoka, a member of the Pate tribe in western Nevada, had a vision, etc., etc., etc. Thousands of Lakota and Sioux natives in the northern plains. Seeing the ghost dance as a sign of renewed native resistance, the army attempted to put a stop to the revival. So, on December 29th, 1890, the 7th Cavalry, which is the regiment that Custer used to lead before he got himself put in the ground, slaughtered 250 Native Americans at Wounded Knee, mostly women and children, because again, that's just how it goes. And this was the last real push for Native resistance. After this, they were too few in number and too weakly spread apart to do anything. And obviously, even like just meeting in large numbers was enough to make the army come and murder them. Can't have that. So, just to back up a little bit, when I say the bison were nearly wiped out, here's a pile of bison skulls. Bison skulls. It's got the top holding one, and then the rest of these are just piles of skulls. Not entire bison skeleton, it's just the skulls. And this was typically how it was done. You just had people sitting on the front of trains, or even just on the side of trains, shooting into herds to thin their numbers, because they'd be on the tracks, and bison are huge. Also, they used to actually live as far east as at least New York State. That's literally the reason why buffalo is called buffalo, because they used to have bison or American buffalo in that region. But we do a real good job of, as I said, wiping out animals. And the only ones that are still around are in Yellowstone National Park, under the protection of the government, at least for now. Oh, right, here is that Sheridan again? Yeah. No, not Sheridan, Sheridan. So, by the sweat of thy brow, thou shalt eat bread, and you will be happy. This is a school for savages, or teaching the young idea not to shoot. Big engine, white man, hold on, we want big talkie. General Sheridan, no, I'll whip you first, then we can big talkie afterwards. So, the abuse and mistreatment of the natives was part of the policy. Like it wasn't, oh, we've got to get violent with them because they're getting violent with us. No, that was just part of American policy, was go in, beat them until they can't even stand up, and then, oh, we're here to help. Also, this weird 2012 Dolls Act political cartoon, which isn't too far off. It was just the American government eating native land and giving them back the scraps. If you've ever seen that weird Stephen King movie, Langoliers, that's what that reminds me of. And finally, because again we have photography back then, we have quite a few shots of the massacre of Wounded Knee. Just dead bodies laid out in the snow. And then also the mass grave, where they just dumped bodies. And here it's titled Burial of the Dead at the Battle of Wounded Knee, because, you know, it's a battle when one side doesn't fight back. But hey, we don't know anything about misinterpreting events. All right. So that's depressing. But we'd still have some other stuff going on in the West that wasn't just wiping out the people that were living there. There was mining. And again, this was like the main reason why so many settlers were heading west and just completely ignoring the fact that technically on paper they weren't supposed to get onto native land. Discovery of gold in California in 1848. So for 30 years after we had gold and silver strikes in Nevada, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and the Dakotas. So people were heading west, particularly prospectors that were hoping to find new veins of ore for themselves and not have to worry about sharing it with others. The biggest strike was the Comstock lode that had about $350 million worth of silver. I believe that's in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I've got a map of it here in just a minute. Anyway. However, if you were going west to try to strike a claim on your own, you could only really get so much. You could do some surface digging, but when it came to actually getting down, getting down in the mines, that was for the big industries. So once a vein was discovered, and another part of this, if you've again ever seen any kind of like Western movie, whenever there's a prospector, they're always like real paranoid and suspicious of everybody because they know if the word of their claim gets out that big businesses will move in and put a mine down, and then they'll go from just digging up whatever little ore they can to having to work in the mine for a wage. So of all these folks who did head west, many of them were, or sorry, about half of them were foreign born, either from Mexico or China. I guess the ones from China were heading east, technically. Now, as far as life as a miner, you could expect about $4 a day, which wasn't bad for the 1800s. However, because the only place to live in that time were the boomtowns were pretty expensive. So you making $4 a day was barely getting by in these boomtowns. You weren't making yourself rich working mines. Also, work was dangerous. The book mentions temperatures in the shafts reaching well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, noxious fumes, fires, floods of scalding water. People died in the mines a lot. And these weren't just, none of this is even cave-ins. Cave-ins happen more often in coal mines because that's much softer dirt and whatnot. This is hard rock. So cave-ins not as often, but everything else will kill you. The noxious fumes is something that I wouldn't really think about underground, but then you realize that, for example, we get helium from underground. There's just like pockets of helium under, I want to say Arkansas, and that's like 90% of the world's stock of helium, because these are just gases trapped underground from the formation of the Earth. And if you're underground digging for gold or whatever, and you break into what seems to be an empty room, you might get your lungs filled with air that's not meant for breathing, and you die. So this is actually where the canary in the coal mine comes from, because canaries are so small, well, birds in general. They're small, and birds especially have a very specialized lung system where when they breathe, rather than like we breathe in and out, and that's how we get oxygen, it's just like a constant stream for birds. That means that if you've got a canary in a little bird cage with you while you're mining, and the canary suddenly falls off its perch, passed out, you've hit some carbon monoxide, because you can't smell carbon monoxide, but it makes you sleepy, and then you die. But it knocks the canary out first, and that means you need to leave. And apparently, around that time, they made like these canary resuscitators where they could, once they got out, they could put this thing around the cage and like pump oxygen into the cage to hopefully revive the canary. So that's kind of neat. Usually I was like, oh, well, they just throw the canary out because the canary's dead. But hey, sometimes they wanted to keep the canary around. So barely making enough to survive and working a job that would very likely kill you led many miners to organize, though of course mining companies didn't want this to happen, because how dare the workers want to not die and make decent money. So oftentimes they would call in the National Guard or state militias, which themselves were funded by the companies, to break or indeed crush the strikes. We will talk more about strike breaking in chapter 17. We talk about unions and whatnot and how violent some of the strike-breaking actions were. So here we have the Comstock Lode. Yeah, right here in the Sierra Nevada mountains, Southern California. And if you've ever been to the mountains, they have little like fake panning things where they've got gravel and dirt and whatnot, and then like little flecks of gold, and you can shake it out on a pan. And if you do it correctly, you'll shake out all the extra sediment, and the gold will be left behind because gold's so much heavier than all the other stuff around it. And that way, if you find that in a river, you know that you've got to be near a gold vein, because the river is cutting through the mountains and is picking up that gold from somewhere, presumably nearby, because again, the gold is heavy, so it's not going to flow very far. They also had these flume things, which were similar to that, but just bigger. So here we have, these look like, well, at least the guys over here are Chinese immigrants. This guy's got way too much of a beard to be a Chinese immigrant. Dude looks like a Mormon. I don't know. We'll talk about them later as well. And then another larger flume. Same sort of thing. They just like run gravel and, well, I say gravel, detritus, and water through it and look for shiny flecks of gold. And then once these veins were discovered and you got as much surface digging done as you could, in the best possible case scenario, then the big companies will move in and you would be sent underground. And sometimes you would lose your soul. This poor guy back here. It wasn't a great job. So there we have boomtowns. I think this might be Virginia City. Somewhere in Nevada. And then the various strikes, where oftentimes the wives and daughters of the union workers would come out to try to talk down the militia, or really Pinkertons, who were there just to put an end to things one way or another. All right, let's talk about life in mining towns, and then we can be done. Because after that is cowboys, so this is a good way to end this. All right. So men were typically the ones working in the mines. However, there were actually a lot of women who headed west as well. Again, if you watch a Western, it's like 80-90% men, and then there's like a few women, ones like running the inn, and then there's like the sweetheart of the main guy, and like maybe the mayor's daughter. Like there's maybe 6 women in the whole town. However, realistically, there was a census in Story County, Nevada. This was right in the middle of the Comstock Lode. So this is a good representation of overall western towns, Story County, Nevada. About 50% of the population was female. It was about 50-50 in these western boom towns. That's pretty impressive, considering, again, what the stereotypical Western idea is. Most of them worked in boarding houses, hotels, private homes as domestic laborers. You know, quote, women's work back then, but it needed to be done. And these dirty men working in the mines certainly weren't going to do it. However, the most common job for women was prostitution, which at the time was still legal, so it was just part of the town. This tended to pay better than most jobs, but it was also pretty dangerous because, well, you're dealing with these unmarried men who were working in mines all day and potentially going to die tomorrow, so they weren't super stable. So, with deposits being very finite, as they dried up, people just up and left the towns. These boom towns then became ghost towns. So, for example, again, taking one of the large cities in the area, Virginia City, showed the number of prostitutes had gone down by more than half by 1880. And considering the prostitutes were like the main source of employment for women, and women were like 50% of the population, that decline in that sector of the economy is a good indication of the entire town. Now, mining still continued. They went from gold and silver to copper, lead, and zinc, but the same patterns continued. Prospectors would go out, find an ore deposit, then the big companies would move in and take over. So by the time we got to about 1900, we had the Amalgamated Copper Company and the American Smelting and Refining Company that pretty much ran the mining and, obviously, smelting, refining businesses. Now, there were some towns, such as Butte, Montana, that did actually settle down. They didn't just, everybody up and left. They managed to have I guess you'd say a critical mass of population that the town was able to sustain itself. And people moved in, they settled down, young men got married. But the social structures of the East stayed. The rich had the better parts of town, the poor and marginalized classes were put in the poorer parts of town and left there to rot because, well, we all know how that works. So, just some images here of the West. You had your commercial hotel. There's, I believe this is I think this is an iron foundry based on just all the smoke. There's some more folks out working, or prospecting, I should say, but including the women, because when you're out prospecting, there's not much time to be like, oh, this isn't women's work. It's like, get out here and grab a shovel. We got work to do. Let's find us some gold. There is the California Bar, Italian boarding and rooming house. Again, Italians were not well treated in America, so this was specifically a place that Italians could go, whoops. So you had that. And then finally, working gals, a much higher resolution image because they're actually inside where you're not getting hit by the sun. And I think that's it for that. Oh, no, wait, sorry. There are still ghost towns out in the West today. Obviously, they're preserved by either historic preservation societies or the state government because they're really good tourist traps. But these are legitimate ghost towns. Just they would have probably rotted away by now if we weren't keeping them up to some degree. But this was an old town. This isn't the same picture, but here is a picture from that era of a ghost town, of a town where people have all just up and left, and that's all that's left there is the hollow, dead buildings. All right, that'll do it. We'll talk about cowboys next time. We'll actually have a full week. Although for my online students, I am going to put up a discussion day later on, so keep an eye out for that.